The Galactic Safety Council's main auditorium stretched out like a vast amphitheater, its bioluminescent walls pulsing with soft blue light as delegates from 47 different species settled into their specially designed seats. The air itself shimmered with translation fields, allowing beings who communicated through everything from ultrasonic clicks to pheromone releases to understand each other. Today's gathering represented the largest interspecies assembly in over a decade, and the tension was palpable. Ambassador Zethkar of the Vrex Federation approached the central podium, his chitinous exoskeleton gleaming under the overhead lights. Standing nearly 3 meters tall, with 4 articulated arms and compound eyes that could track multiple targets simultaneously, he was an imposing figure even by galactic standards. His species had been the first to encounter humans during a routine survey mission, and the memory of that contact still sent nervous clicks through his thoracic chambers. Esteemed colleagues, his voice emerged as a series of melodic clicks and whistles, immediately translated by the universal communication matrix into dozens of languages and formats. We convene today to address the most pressing security concern facing our civilized galaxy. The assembled delegates shifted uneasily. The crystalline Zaith representatives dimmed their natural luminescence to barely visible levels, their species equivalent of holding their breath. The aquatic Delphians wrapped their tentacles more tightly around their moisture retention suits, while the ethereal voidlings flickered between visible and translucent states, betraying their anxiety. 3 solar cycles ago, we classified the species known as humans as Level 9 hazard on the Galactic Threat Assessment Scale. Zethkar continued, his 4 arms working in perfect synchronization to manipulate the massive holographic display that materialized above the assembly. Today, I present evidence that suggests this classification may be insufficient. A ripple of concerned murmurs, chirps, and harmonic vibrations swept through the auditorium. Level 9 was reserved for species capable of planetary destruction. What could possibly warrant a higher classification? The holographic display flickered to life, showing a blue and green marble suspended in the darkness of space. Earth. Beautiful, serene, and according to their analysis, utterly lethal. Allow me to present the death world known as Earth, Zethkar announced, his translator adding extra emphasis to the words, death world. A planet so hostile that our xenobiologists initially classified it as uninhabitable. Yet somehow, impossibly, it has spawned not just life, but an apex predator species that has not only survived but thrived in conditions that would exterminate most known civilizations. The image zoomed in, revealing swirling white patterns across the planet's surface that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. The display showed wind speeds, pressure differentials, and electromagnetic readings that made several delegates recoil in their seats. Behold, Zethkar's voice dropped to what humans might recognize as a theatrical whisper. The hurricane zone, atmospheric disturbances that generate winds exceeding 300 kilometers per hour, electrical discharges with the power to level cities, and pressure systems that can lift objects weighing several tons and hurl them across vast distances. The thermal-based Ignis delegates began glowing brighter, their stress response, while the plant-like Chlorophians rustled their fronds in what could only be described as vegetative horror. These storms, Zethkar continued, his compound eyes scanning the audience for maximum dramatic effect, appear with such regularity that the humans have developed systematic naming conventions for them. They track them, study them, and most disturbing of all, they celebrate their arrival with gatherings they call hurricane parties. The auditorium erupted in a cacophony of shocked responses. Sonic-based species emitted ear-piercing frequencies, while the more sedate mineral-based petrons ground their rocky appendages together in what passed for their equivalent of gasping. But from Row 4, Section C, came a sound that cut through the chaos like a plasma blade through neutronium. Laughter. Pure, genuine human laughter. Every being in the auditorium turned their attention, whether through eyes, sensors, or psychic awareness, toward the source of the sound. There, attempting to cover her mouth with one hand while her shoulders shook with barely contained mirth, sat Dr. Elena Vasquez, the human observer assigned to monitor the proceedings. The silence that followed was profound and deeply unsettling. Elena's laughter echoed in the vast space for a moment before she managed to compose herself, though her eyes still sparkled with amusement. Zethkar's compound eyes fixed on her with the intensity of a targeting system. His mandibles clicked together in what his species recognized as extreme agitation. "Dr. Vasquez," he said, his translator struggling to render the frosty politeness of his tone. "Perhaps you would care to enlighten the assembly as to what you find so amusing about atmospheric phenomena capable of wiping out entire population centers?" Elena cleared her throat and rose from her seat, standing to her full, and by galactic standards, surprisingly modest height of 1.7 meters. Despite being one of the smallest beings in the room, every eye, sensor, and consciousness was focused on her. "I sincerely apologize, Ambassador," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the translation fields. "It's just that, well, you called Category 5 hurricanes our most lethal zones, and I have to admit that caught me off guard." She gestured toward the still-rotating holographic storm. "I grew up in Miami, Florida, right in what we call Hurricane Alley. We get storms like this pretty regularly. Most of the time, we just board up the windows, stock up on snacks, and wait for them to blow over. My grandmother used to make popcorn and watch them from her porch." The silence that greeted this revelation was not just quiet. It was the kind of absolute stillness that occurs when an entire room of sentient beings simultaneously questions everything they thought they knew about the universe. "We call those Tuesday," Elena added helpfully. The auditorium's atmosphere had shifted dramatically. What began as a routine briefing had transformed into something resembling a xenobiological horror presentation, with Dr. Elena Vasquez cast in the unlikely role of the monster. Ambassador Zethkar's exoskeleton was now gleaming with a thin sheen of nervous perspiration, a biological response his species had evolved during their homeworld's ice age, when predators could detect fear through scent. Determined to shatter the human's inexplicable composure, Zethkar gestured sharply with his primary manipulator arms. The holographic display dissolved and reformed, this time showing an endless expanse of golden sand dunes stretching beyond the horizon. The virtual sun blazed overhead with such intensity that several light-sensitive species immediately activated their protective eye shields. "Behold," Zethkar announced, his voice taking on the cadence of a funeral dirge, "the Sahara Desert. 9 million square kilometers of absolute desolation." The hologram zoomed in, revealing surface temperatures that made the atmospheric processors of several delegates work frantically as they tried to compensate for the perceived heat. Readouts appeared alongside the image, surface temperatures reaching 58 degrees Celsius, humidity levels near zero, and wind patterns that could generate sandstorms visible from orbit. Here we witnessed temperatures that would literally cook the internal organs of most known species. Zethkar continued, his compound eyes reflecting the orange glow of the holographic sun. Atmospheric moisture so scarce that exposed flesh desiccates within hours. Sandstorms with the abrading power to strip paint from starship hulls, and an ecosystem so barren that our xenobiologists initially classified it as a post-apocalyptic wasteland. The plant-based chlorophyans were now rustling their fronds in distress, their photosynthetic processes going haywire at the mere thought of such solar intensity without adequate water. The aquatic delphians had increased the flow rate of their moisture suits, creating a soft humming sound that added to the general atmosphere of dread. Thousands of kilometers of terrain where no water exists, Zethkar pressed on, warming to his theme, where the temperature differential between day and night can exceed 40 degrees, where venomous creatures burrow beneath the sand, waiting to strike at any organic matter foolish enough to traverse this hellscape. Surely even humans. "Oh, the Sahara!" Elena exclaimed, her face positively radiant with enthusiasm. "What an absolutely beautiful place. I spent the best 3 months of my graduate career there." The effect of her words was immediate and profound. The thermal-dependent salamandrians, who required constant heat regulation, began flickering between their various temperature states in confusion. How could any being speak with such warmth about a place that represented the antithesis of life? You voluntarily went there?" stammered the lead Aquarian delegate, his gills fluttering so rapidly they created a visible disturbance in his breathing apparatus. "Well, went is putting it mildly." Elena laughed, apparently oblivious to the growing horror around her. I lived there for my doctoral thesis on extremophile bacteria. Camped right near the Rickhat structure. That's this amazing geological formation that looks like a giant eye from space. The locals call it the Eye of the Sahara. The Petron delegate, whose silicon-based physiology was theoretically more resistant to temperature extremes, ground his rocky appendages together in what passed for his species' expression of disbelief. Camped? In the desert of death? Camping might be generous, Elena admitted with a self-deprecating smile. We had proper expedition gear, shade cloths rated for extreme UV, solar stills for water production, sealed habitat modules. The real challenge wasn't the heat, actually. It was keeping the sand out of our equipment. That stuff gets into everything. I was finding sand in my sample containers weeks after we left. Zethkar's mandibles were now clicking so rapidly they created an almost musical percussion. His carefully prepared presentation was not just failing, it was backfiring spectacularly. He glanced at his notes, hoping to find some detail that would finally break through the human's cheerful facade. But the temperature, he began desperately. Oh, that was nothing compared to Death Valley, Elena said casually. Now that place gets hot. 54.4 degrees Celsius on record, though we've measured higher in some microclimates. And you know what we did there? We built a golf course. The silence that followed this statement was broken only by the soft whirring of life support systems and the increasingly frantic clicking of translation matrices trying to process concepts that seemed to defy logical interpretation. A golf course. The question came from the crystalline delegate, whose harmonic voice usually resonated with perfect clarity, but now carried undertones of confused dissonance. Furnace Creek Golf Course, Elena confirmed brightly. It's actually quite popular during the winter months. We get thousands of tourists every year. There's a whole industry built around desert tourism, hiking, photography, stargazing. The night skies in the desert are absolutely spectacular. Tourists, repeated the felinoid representative in a whisper so quiet his translator almost missed it. You have recreational visitors? To the Death Desert? Oh yes. Death Valley National Park sees over 1 million visitors annually. We have visitor centers, hotels, restaurants. There's even a marathon, though I'll admit, running 42 kilometers in that heat is a bit extreme even for us. The soft thud that echoed through the chamber was the Glyconian delegate's gelatinous form hitting the floor as his consciousness temporarily shut down to protect his psyche from processing this information. The medical drones immediately swarmed to assist him, their built-in AIs registering vital signs that suggested acute psychological trauma. Elena looked concerned. Oh my, is he all right? I hope I didn't say something wrong. Should I not have mentioned the marathon? The medical drones finished stabilizing the Glyconian delegate, whose gelatinous form was slowly regaining its normal consistency. Zethkar watched the proceedings with growing alarm, his forearms trembling slightly as he realized his carefully orchestrated presentation was becoming a disaster of galactic proportions. The other delegates were whispering among themselves in dozens of languages, and the translation matrix was struggling to keep up with the overlapping conversations about human adaptability and species-wide insanity. Sweat, or rather, the chitinous equivalent, continued to bead on Zethkar's exoskeleton as he desperately accessed his next display. Surely this one would finally demonstrate to the assembly the true horror of humanity's homeworld. Surely no rational being could find anything positive to say about what he was about to show them. The holographic display flickered and transformed once more, this time revealing a landscape so stark and forbidding that several delegates instinctively activated their heating systems. An endless expanse of white stretched beyond the horizon, broken only by jagged ice formations that jutted from the surface like the bones of some primordial beast. The virtual wind howled through the auditorium speakers, a sound so desolate that the harmony-based melodian's natural humming dropped to discordant minor keys. Antarctica? Zethkar announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. The most hostile continent on the death world Earth. A frozen wasteland where temperatures plummet to minus 89 degrees Celsius, cold enough to freeze the atmosphere itself of some worlds. The holographic display zoomed in to show wind speed measurements that made even the storm-adapted Tempistan delegates recoil. Readings appeared in stark, clinical fonts. Katabatic winds exceeding 200 kilometers per hour, humidity levels so low they would desiccate most organic matter in minutes, and a sun that disappeared completely for months at a time, leaving the continent in perpetual darkness. Observe, Zethkar continued, his confidence building as he watched the delegates' horrified reactions. A place where exposed flesh freezes solid in under 60 seconds, where the very moisture in your respiratory system can crystallize, causing death by internal laceration. Where storms rage with such violence that they can bury entire research installations beneath meters of ice. The plant-based chlorophians were now making distressed rustling sounds, their fronds curling inward as if trying to protect themselves from the virtual cold. The thermal salamandrians had activated their emergency heating systems, glowing so brightly they were painful to look at directly. No natural plant life, Zethkar pressed on, savoring what he was certain would be his moment of triumph. No shelter of any kind for thousands of kilometers. No liquid water except what can be created by melting ice, a process that requires precious energy most species would need for basic survival. This is a place where even our most advanced cold-weather equipment fails within hours. Surely. Oh, I love Antarctica. Elena practically bounced in her seat, her enthusiasm so genuine and infectious that it would have been endearing under any other circumstances. I spent an entire winter there during my postdoctoral research. Absolutely incredible experience. The effect of her words was like dropping a neutron bomb in a library. The silence was so complete that the auditorium's atmospheric processors seemed unnaturally loud. Even the translation matrices seemed to hiccup, as if the AIs controlling them were having difficulty processing what they had just heard. The lead thermal delegate, whose species had evolved on a planet orbiting twin suns, finally managed to speak, his voice emerging as barely more than a whisper. You spent winter in the frozen wasteland, voluntarily? McMurdo Station, Elena replied cheerfully, as if she were discussing a pleasant vacation resort. It's like a little city on the ice. We had about 1,000 people during the summer season, dropping down to maybe 150 during the winter. Amazing community. Everyone looks out for everyone else when you're that isolated. But the cold, stammered one of the Aquarian delegates, his gills fluttering so rapidly they were creating visible turbulence in his breathing apparatus. Oh, it's all about proper gear and preparation, Elena said matter-of-factly. Insulated clothing, heated buildings, backup power systems. We've been working in Antarctica for over a century now. Multiple permanent research stations, landing strips, even a few scattered emergency shelters. The key is respecting the environment and preparing properly. Zethkar's compound eyes were now tracking Elena with the intensity of targeting computers. But surely you remained safely inside heated shelters? Elena laughed, a sound that was beginning to haunt the nightmares of several delegates. Well, not always. Field research requires actually going out into the field. I spent weeks camping on the Ross ice shelf, taking core samples and studying ice formation patterns. And there was that amazing night when the aurora australis was so bright we could read by it. Absolutely breathtaking. You camped on the ice? The question came from the Petron delegate, whose rocky voice was grinding with disbelief. Specialized equipment, of course. Polarated tents, sleeping systems rated to -40, proper layering techniques. Though I'll admit, there was that one storm where we had to dig our tents out from under 2 meters of snow. That was exciting. The word exciting seemed to echo through the chamber like a death knell. We also had recreational activities, Elena continued, oblivious to the growing horror around her. Movie nights, a coffee shop, though the coffee was terrible, and there was even a marathon. The Last Degree Marathon, running 42 kilometers at the South Pole. Though to be fair, that's pretty intense even by human standards. A marathon, the crystalline delegate repeated in harmonics so low they were almost subsonic. At the frozen pole of death. The views are incredible, Elena added helpfully. And the wildlife, penguins, seals, whales offshore. The ecosystem is actually quite rich if you know where to look. We've discovered all sorts of life in the ice itself. Microorganisms that thrive in sub-zero temperatures. Life finds a way, you know? The soft thud of another delegate hitting the floor, this time one of the phelinoids, was almost anticlimactic at this point. The medical drones were working overtime now, having to tend to an increasing number of delegates whose biological systems were simply refusing to process the information they were receiving. The phelinoid who had just fainted was being administered neural stabilizers, while several other species had requested emergency psychological counseling. The auditorium's environmental systems were struggling to maintain optimal conditions for 47 different physiologies, all of which were currently in various states of distress. Zethkar's exoskeleton was now gleaming with so much nervous perspiration that the overhead lights created an almost rainbow effect across his chitinous surface. His forearms moved with increasingly frantic energy as he accessed what he desperately hoped would be his trump card. Surely no species, no matter how insanely adaptable, could find anything positive to say about what he was about to display. The holographic projector hummed to life once more, and this time the very air in the auditorium seemed to shimmer with heat and danger. The display erupted into a spectacular panorama of destruction. Molten rock fountaining hundreds of meters into the air, pyroclastic flows racing down mountainsides at impossible speeds, and ash clouds so massive they blotted out entire star systems in the projection. The Pacific Ring of Fire, Zethkar announced with the desperate triumph of a being playing his final card. Behold the ultimate demonstration of planetary instability. The hologram zoomed in to show the terrifying reality of Earth's most geologically active region. Magma temperatures exceeded 1,200 degrees Celsius, hot enough to vaporize most known metals. Seismic readings showed earthquakes that could literally split continents, while tsunami projections displayed waves tall enough to engulf orbital platforms. Here we witness volcanic eruptions with the power to alter planetary weather patterns. Zethkar continued, his voice rising with religious fervor. Earthquakes that can shift the very axis of planetary rotation. Tsunamis capable of wiping out entire continents. The very ground itself splits open, swallowing cities whole before spewing forth molten death from the planet's core. The mineral-based petrons were now grinding their rocky appendages together so violently that small chips of stone were falling to the floor. Their entire civilization was built on geological stability. The concept of living with active tectonics was as alien to them as breathing water. Observe, Zethkar pressed on, his compound eyes gleaming with desperate hope. A region where the planet's crust is so unstable that massive population centers can be reduced to rubble without warning. Where mountains literally explode, hurling debris into the upper atmosphere. Where the very air becomes toxic with sulfur compounds and volcanic ash. The atmospheric readings displayed alongside the imagery showed particulate levels that would clog the breathing apparatus of most known species within minutes. The thermal salamandrians, despite their heat tolerance, were flickering between temperature states in obvious distress at the chaotic energy patterns. Surely, Zethkar said, his voice dropping to what he hoped was a dramatic whisper. Surely no rational species would choose to establish major population centers in such an obviously unstable region. The risk assessment algorithms of any civilized species would classify such areas as uninhabitable exclusion zones. The assembled delegates leaned forward in their seats, finally certain they would witness the humans' composure crack. Even Elena couldn't possibly have a positive spin on living atop active volcanic systems and major fault lines. Oh, that's where I'm from, Elena exclaimed with such genuine delight that several translation matrices temporarily glitched. Well, California specifically, which sits right on the San Andreas Fault. Beautiful state. We've got some of the most stunning coastline you've ever seen. The silence that followed was so profound it seemed to have physical weight. Even the atmospheric processors seemed to hesitate, as if the building's AI was having trouble accepting what it had just heard. Your homestead, is located on an active tectonic fracture? The question came from the lead geological survey delegate, a being whose entire species had evolved on a planet so stable they measured seismic activity in geological epochs. Los Angeles, specifically, Elena said cheerfully. About 20 million people in the metropolitan area. One of our major entertainment and technology centers. We film movies there, develop cutting-edge technology, and produce a significant portion of our agricultural output just inland. But the earthquakes, stammered the Petron delegate, his rocky voice literally cracking with disbelief. Oh, we get those fairly regularly. Most of them are just little shakes, kind of fun, actually. Reminds you that the planet is alive and dynamic. The big ones are pretty rare, and we've developed excellent building codes and early warning systems. Zethkar's mandibles were now clicking so rapidly they sounded like a percussion instrument. Fun? You consider tectonic instability to be recreational? Elena paused, seeming to consider this seriously for the first time. Well, not the destructive parts, obviously. But there's something humbling about feeling the planet move beneath your feet. It puts things in perspective. Reminds you that we're just temporary visitors on a world that's been reshaping itself for billions of years. And the volcanoes? Whispered the thermal delegate, his glow fluctuating wildly. Oh, those are incredible. Mount Shasta, Mount Rainier, the entire Cascade Range. And don't get me started on Hawaii. People travel from all over the world to see active lava flows. We have volcano tourism, helicopter tours, even lava hiking when conditions are safe. Lava hiking? The questions seemed to come from multiple delegates simultaneously. Well, you have to be careful and have proper guides, but walking on cooled lava flows is amazing. The geological formations are unlike anything else on Earth. And the soil around volcanic regions is incredibly fertile. Some of our best wine regions are on volcanic slopes. The soft sound of another delegate hitting the floor was becoming disturbingly routine. You cultivate recreational crops adjacent to active volcanic systems? Napa Valley, parts of Oregon, the slopes of Mount Vesuvius in Italy, though that one's admittedly a bit more exciting than most people prefer. The volcanic soil is perfect for grapes. Creates wines with unique mineral profiles you can't get anywhere else. Elena's enthusiasm was building as she warmed to her topic. And the geothermal energy. We've learned to harness the Earth's internal heat for power generation. Iceland gets most of their energy that way. Instead of fearing the planet's power, we've learned to work with it. The auditorium had transformed into something resembling a field hospital. Medical drones buzzed between delegates like mechanical angels of mercy, administering everything from neural stabilizers to emergency psychological counseling protocols. The environmental systems were working at maximum capacity, trying to maintain atmospheric conditions suitable for beings whose stress responses ranged from temperature fluctuations to chromatic seizures. Several species had requested permission to leave, but morbid fascination kept them rooted to their seats. Zethkar stood at the podium like a being possessed, his 4 arms moving with the frantic energy of someone who knew he was fighting a losing battle but couldn't bring himself to surrender. Rivulets of perspiration now cascaded down his exoskeleton, pooling at his feet in a way that would have been undignified under normal circumstances. But these were far from normal circumstances. His compound eyes fixed on Elena with the intensity of a hunter who had cornered his prey, only to discover that the prey was actually an apex predator wearing an innocent smile. This was his final gambit, his ultimate revelation. Surely, no species could have conquered what he was about to display. The holographic projector engaged with a deep harmonic hum that seemed to resonate through the very foundations of the building. The cheerful blues and greens of Earth's surface vanished, replaced by something so alien and terrifying that several delegates immediately activated their emergency lighting systems. The display plunged into absolute darkness, broken only by the eerie bioluminescent glows of creatures that seemed to have crawled out of some cosmic nightmare. The deep ocean, Zethkar announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute finality. The ultimate abyss that covers 70% of the human homeworld. The hologram descended through layers of increasingly hostile water, each depth marker appearing like a countdown to oblivion. Pressure readings climbed to levels that would crush most starship hulls like empty beverage containers. The temperature dropped to barely above freezing, while the complete absence of solar radiation created an environment more alien than most planets. Observe pressure levels exceeding 1,000 times standard atmospheric pressure. Zethkar continued, his voice building to a crescendo of scientific horror. Depths so profound that if the tallest mountains on most worlds were dropped into these trenches, they would vanish completely beneath kilometers of crushing water. The pressure readings were displayed in stark numerical reality. 1,086 times Earth's surface pressure at the deepest measured points. The Aquarian delegates, despite being water-adapted, were making distressed gurgling sounds as they contemplated pressures that would compress their bodies into dense organic paste. Complete absence of solar radiation, Zethkar pressed on relentlessly. Temperatures that hover just above the freezing point of water. An environment so hostile that our xenobiologists initially theorized it was completely sterile. A liquid desert more barren than the vacuum of space itself. The bioluminescent creatures in the hologram seemed to mock this assessment, their alien forms pulsing with otherworldly light. Creatures with massive teeth, transparent bodies, and appendages that defied conventional biology drifted through the virtual water like living nightmares. And yet, Zethkar's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the vast auditorium. Life exists in these crushing depths. Creatures so adapted to pressure that they would literally explode if brought to the surface. Organisms that derive energy not from solar radiation, but from volcanic vents that spew superheated, toxic chemicals into the water. The assembled delegates were transfixed by the horror of it all. Even the most scientifically minded among them struggled to comprehend an ecosystem based on crushing pressure and toxic chemistry. Surely, Zethkar said, his voice carrying the desperate hope of a being making his final stand. Surely no rational species would attempt to explore such an environment. The engineering challenges alone would be insurmountable. The pressure differential would require technology beyond. Oh, deep-sea exploration. Elena's voice cut through his dramatic buildup like a plasma cutter through paper, bright with unmistakable excitement. I absolutely love marine biology. The deep ocean is where some of our most incredible discoveries happen. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The collective intake of breath or equivalent respiratory function from 47 different species created a sound like a reverse wind tunnel. Several delegates' life support systems began beeping warnings as their occupants' vital signs spiked beyond normal parameters. You explore the crushing abyss? The question came from the lead Aquarian delegate, whose own species had never dared venture beyond their continental shelves despite being fully aquatic. We've been to the bottom of every major ocean trench we've found, Elena said with the casual pride of someone discussing a successful hobby. Challenger Deep in the Mariana Trench, the Puerto Rico Trench, the Peru-Chile Trench. We've sent both robotic probes and manned submersibles to depths exceeding 11 kilometers. Manned submersibles? The crystalline Zaith delegate's harmonic voice cracked on the words. Oh yes, the Trieste reached Challenger Deep back in 1960, and we've been improving the technology ever since. The limiting factor has made multiple dives to the deepest points in all 5 oceans. We've even had filmmakers go down there. James Cameron, one of our entertainment industry pioneers, piloted his own submarine to the bottom of Challenger Deep just to see what was down there. Your artists descend into the abyss for recreational purposes? The question seemed to come from multiple delegates simultaneously, their translation matrices struggling with the concept. He made a documentary about it too, Elena continued enthusiastically. The footage is incredible. And the life forms we've discovered. Anglerfish with bioluminescent lures, giant tube worms around hydrothermal vents, creatures that look like living glass. There are entire ecosystems down there that don't depend on the sun at all. They get their energy from chemosynthesis around volcanic vents. The thermal salamandrian delegate was now glowing so brightly he was painful to look at directly. You study. You willingly interact with creatures adapted to crushing death? Some of our most important biological discoveries have come from deep-sea research, Elena said, warming to her subject. Medications, insights into evolution, understanding of how life can exist in extreme conditions. We've even found organisms that might give us clues about possible life on other worlds, extremophiles that thrive in conditions that would kill surface organisms. Other worlds. Zethkar's voice was barely a whisper. Oh yes, astrobiological research suggests that if we find life elsewhere in the universe, it might resemble deep-sea organisms more than surface life. The deep ocean is like an alien planet right here on Earth. That's why we study it so intensively. The sound of multiple delegates hitting the floor simultaneously was becoming disturbingly familiar. The auditorium had descended into something resembling controlled chaos. Medical drones swarmed through the air like metallic insects, their emergency beacons casting eerie patterns across the walls as they attended to delegates in various states of psychological distress. The Glyconian representative had fainted so many times that the medical AI had simply stationed a permanent stabilization unit next to his gelatinous form. 3 different species had requested immediate communication with their homeworld governments, while the crystalline Zaith delegates had begun pulsing in synchronized patterns that their xenopsychologists would later classify as a collective anxiety response. Ambassador Zethkar stood at the podium like a being who had witnessed the fundamental laws of the universe being casually violated. His 4 arms hung limply at his sides, still trembling from the adrenaline equivalent that his species produced under extreme stress. The holographic display flickered weakly behind him, showing a random rotation of Earth's most hostile environments, each one a death sentence by any rational assessment, each one cheerfully described by the human as a recreational destination. The other delegates were no longer bothering to maintain diplomatic composure. Panicked conversations erupted across the assembly in dozens of languages, creating a cacophony that the translation matrices were struggling to process. Words and concepts that had never before appeared in galactic diplomatic discourse were being frantically transmitted to homeworlds: vacation volcanism, recreational hypothermia, abyssal tourism, and tectonic entertainment. Elena, seemingly oblivious to the chaos she had unleashed, raised her hand with the polite patience of someone waiting to ask a question during a university lecture. The gesture was so innocuous, so fundamentally normal, that it somehow managed to cut through the pandemonium like a sonic blade. Conversations died mid-sentence as every being in the auditorium turned to focus on her with the intensity of prey animals spotting a predator. "Ambassador Zethkar," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but where exactly did you get your information about Earth's environmental hazards?" Zethkar's compound eyes focused on her with something approaching desperation. Here, finally, was a question he could answer with confidence. "From your own planetary databases," he replied, his mandibles clicking with renewed hope. "Comprehensive scientific reports from your most prestigious research institutions. Survival statistics, environmental impact assessments, hazard classifications, all compiled by your own scientists studying extreme environments." Elena's face lit up with understanding, and she nodded in a way that somehow managed to be both sympathetic and terrifying. "Ah, I think I see the problem now. You've been reading our research papers on extreme environments and disaster preparedness protocols." She stood gracefully, her modest human height somehow commanding the attention of beings 3 times her size. "You see, those reports are written by scientists studying the absolute limits of environmental survivability. They're designed to identify worst-case scenarios and maximum risk factors." The assembled delegates leaned forward despite themselves, caught between fascination and horror at what she might reveal next. "But here's the thing," Elena continued with the enthusiasm of someone sharing a delightful discovery. "What you're calling lethal zones are what we call home. We don't just survive in these places, we thrive there. We've built entire civilizations in what your databases classify as uninhabitable regions." She gestured toward the cycling holographic display. "Take hurricanes, for example. Yes, they're dangerous if you're unprepared, but we've learned to predict them, prepare for them, and even harness their power. Hurricane season doesn't send us fleeing. It sends meteorologists and storm chasers racing toward the storms to study them." The atmospheric dynamics specialist from the Windswept Collective made a sound that their translator rendered as profound existential distress. "And tourism," Elena added with growing excitement, "is one of our largest industries. Millions of people travel specifically to experience these extreme environments. We have adventure tourism, ecological tourism, geological tourism. People pay significant amounts of money to visit active volcanic regions, dive in hurricane-prone waters, trek across deserts, and climb mountains in sub-zero temperatures. But why? The question erupted from multiple delegates simultaneously, their various vocal apparatus creating a discordant chorus of confusion. Elena paused, considering how to explain something so fundamental to human nature that she had never really questioned it herself. I think it comes down to how we evolved, she said thoughtfully. Earth didn't give us an easy environment. Every biome on our planet has something that can kill you if you're careless. So we learned to adapt, to overcome, to find ways not just to survive, but to flourish in challenging conditions. She pointed to the image of a massive volcanic eruption currently displayed in the hologram. We don't see that as a disaster waiting to happen. We see it as a force of nature that built the very ground we stand on. The volcanic soil feeds our crops. The geothermal energy powers our cities. And yes, the spectacle draws tourists from around the world. You find beauty in destruction, whispered the harmony-based Melodian delegate, their musical voice cracking with disbelief. We find beauty in power, Elena corrected gently, in the raw forces that shape worlds and create life. Every environment you've shown us represents not just a challenge, but an opportunity to learn, to grow, to push the boundaries of what's possible. Her expression grew thoughtful as she gazed at the assembled delegates. Maybe that's what makes us different. We don't see hostile environments as barriers to avoid. We see them as frontiers to explore. Because if you're not living a little dangerously, if you're not pushing against the edges of what's possible, then you're not really living at all. The silence that followed was profound and deeply unsettling, broken only by the soft whirring of life support systems and the distant hum of the medical drones attending to delegates who had once again succumbed to the psychological pressure of trying to process human logic. For hours and 17 minutes after Dr. Elena Vasquez had been politely but firmly escorted from the auditorium, accompanied by a full medical team, 3 xenopsychologists, and a crisis intervention specialist, the Galactic Safety Council reconvened in what could only be described as emergency session. The Great Assembly Hall, once a symbol of interspecies cooperation and diplomatic achievement, now resembled the aftermath of a natural disaster. Medical stations had been established in every corner, with specialized equipment humming quietly as it provided ongoing psychological support to delegates whose worldviews had been fundamentally shattered. The Glyconian representative had been placed in a specialized stabilization chamber after his 15th collapse, while the crystalline Zaith delegation was undergoing harmonic realignment therapy to restore their collective consciousness. Emergency counselors from 17 different species worked frantically to process what the diplomatic corps was already calling the human revelation incident. Ambassador Zethkar approached the podium with the bearing of a being who had stared into the abyss and found it staring back with cheerful enthusiasm. His exoskeleton, normally polished to a mirror shine, was dulled with stress perspiration that his species' grooming protocols had been unable to address. His forearms moved with the deliberate care of someone afraid that any sudden motion might trigger another psychological crisis among the assembled delegates. The holographic display, which had earlier showcased Earth's lethal zones, now showed a completely different set of data. Classification protocols, threat assessment matrices, and emergency diplomatic procedures that hadn't been activated since the Void War 3 millennia ago. Fellow delegates, Zethkar began, his voice carrying none of its earlier confidence. After extensive analysis of the information presented today, I am compelled to propose an immediate and unprecedented reclassification of the human species. A ripple of nervous energy passed through the assembly. Several species had already begun preliminary evacuation procedures for their border worlds, while others had initiated defensive protocol discussions with their military commands. From Level 9 hazard species, Zethkar continued, his mandibles clicking with the rhythm of a funeral dirge, to Level 10, the silence that followed was absolute. Level 10 was purely theoretical, a classification created by paranoid xenobiologists for species that exceeded all known threat parameters. It had never been used because the Galactic Safety Council had assumed no such species could actually exist. The lead Petron delegate, his rocky voice grinding with disbelief, finally spoke. Ambassador, Level 10 classification requires evidence of species-wide capabilities that fundamentally challenge our understanding of environmental survivability. Surely, did you not witness the same presentation I gave? Zethkar interrupted, his compound eyes reflecting the holographic data streaming behind him. Humans don't merely survive in lethal environments. They seek them out for recreation. They build their largest population centers in the most geologically unstable regions of their planet. They have turned atmospheric catastrophes into entertainment industries. He gestured to new data appearing in the hologram, human population distributions overlaid with environmental hazard zones. The correlation was not just disturbing, it was completely inverse to any rational species development pattern. New York City, Zethkar announced, his voice taking on the cadence of someone reading a death warrant. Constructed in a swamp, in a hurricane zone, on a geological fault line, at the mouth of a flood-prone river system. Current population, 8 million beings. Economic classification, financial capital of their civilization. Gasps echoed through the chamber from species whose survival instincts were screaming warnings about such obviously catastrophic settlement patterns. Tokyo, Japan, he continued relentlessly. Earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic activity, and typhoons. Population, 37 million. Status, technological and cultural center. San Francisco, major fault line intersection. Status, innovation hub. Los Angeles, wildfire zone, earthquake zone, drought-prone desert region. Status, entertainment capital. The atmospheric dynamics specialist was now making distressed whistling sounds that their translator refused to process, simply displaying error messages instead. But the implications, whispered the Aquarian delegate, his gills fluttering so rapidly they were creating visible turbulence in his breathing apparatus. If they develop interstellar travel capabilities. Exactly, Zethkar said grimly. Every world we have classified as uninhabitable due to environmental extremes, desert planets, ice worlds, high radiation systems, tectonically unstable moons, worlds with toxic atmospheres or crushing gravity. Humans will not only colonize but will probably consider them prime real estate. He pulled up a new holographic display showing various extreme exoplanets that the Galactic Survey had marked as permanently uninhabitable. They'll establish vacation resorts on lava worlds, retirement communities on frozen moons, and entertainment districts in asteroid belts. They'll probably complain that the vacuum of space is too quiet and needs more excitement. The felinoid delegate, who had been conscious for exactly 47 minutes since his last fainting episode, promptly collapsed again. What does this mean for our expansion protocols? Asked the thermal salamandrian, his glow fluctuating wildly between terror and fascination. It means, Zethkar said heavily, that humanity will expand into regions of space we cannot even approach. They will colonize systems that would kill us just for entering them. They will thrive in environments that would serve as effective quarantine zones for any other known species. The elderly wisdom keeper of the Eternal Archive, whose species had observed galactic civilization for 50,000 years, spoke in her ancient, crystalline voice. Perhaps, esteemed colleagues, we have been approaching this incorrectly. Instead of asking whether humans pose a threat to us, we should be asking whether we want them as allies when something truly dangerous emerges from the depths of space. Her words hung in the air like a prophetic warning. In the quantum realm, probability matrices that had been calculating human expansion scenarios suddenly shifted, showing projection outcomes that made even the most advanced AIs pause in their calculations. What if, she continued, her voice carrying the weight of eons, what if the universe contains threats that require beings who consider death worlds to be vacation destinations? What if survival in this galaxy requires the kind of reckless courage that treats environmental catastrophes as tourist attractions? Outside the chamber, in a comfortable debriefing room, Dr. Elena Vasquez sat with a xenobiologist from the Survey Corps, cheerfully explaining human plans for asteroid mining, deep space exploration, and habitat construction around gas giant moons. She was completely unaware that her casual mention of generation ships and interstellar colonization programs was being transmitted directly to the emergency session. The thing is, Elena was saying to her increasingly pale interviewer, we've already identified several promising exoplanet systems. Sure, most of them have environmental challenges, extreme temperatures, high radiation, unusual atmospheric compositions, but that just makes them interesting. We've got preliminary designs for floating cities in gas giant atmospheres, underground colonies for high radiation worlds, and mobile habitats for nomadic asteroid belt communities. The interviewer's hands were shaking as he took notes. And your species finds this appealing? Elena's face lit up with genuine excitement. Oh, absolutely. The engineering challenges alone are fascinating. Plus, think about the views. Imagine watching a binary sunrise from a planet orbiting twin stars, or seeing the aurora patterns on a world with a magnetic field 10 times stronger than Earth's. The universe is vast and full of wonders. We'd hate to miss any of it just because it might be a little challenging. Back in the assembly hall, the final vote was unanimous. Humanity classified as level 10, with a subclassification that had never been used before, beneficial apex adaptation species. The official report's executive summary read, species demonstrates unlimited environmental adaptation capability, combined with exploration-driven expansion patterns. Immediate diplomatic outreach recommended. Potential for alliance exceeds potential for threat by significant margin. Note: when asked about humanity's most dangerous unexplored environment, subject responded, probably the quantum foam layer between dimensions, but we're working on it. Research team has requested immediate reassignment to low-stress positions. The final line of the report, added by the Wisdom Keeper herself, read, the universe is darker and more dangerous than any single species can face alone. Perhaps it has given us allies who are too stubborn to recognize the word impossible.